I started my week coming off of a long period of downtime in San Francisco. With that in mind, I set out for a short 45-mile ride north. But first, crossing the Golden Gate Bridge. It was fairly impressive close up, and pretty cool to see with it half covered in fog. Getting across it, however, wasn't the most pleasant experience. With all of the pedestrians and cyclists out to cross the famous landmark, it was by far the busiest bridge that I've come across. Once over, I carefully made it through the next couple of towns before the tourist traffic eventually began to die down. I finished up the day in Point Reyes Station, California, a small town along Route 1. The next morning, I continued on Route 1 with the intention of reaching Boyega Bay, only 35 miles away. Right from the start, I was beset by a steady stream of hills as I maneuvered along the incredibly windy stretch of road. While the road and scenery made for an interesting morning, the constant steep hills were really starting to bother my knee again. I decided to abandon Route 1 on the coast and instead turn inland towards 101. In addition to finding an easier route for my leg, a friend of mine was planning on being in Portland, Oregon sometime the next week, and I needed to find a way to get up there in time, something that I couldn't do on the coast short of hitchhiking. With that in mind, I finished up my day in Rohnert Park on my way to Sacramento, where I would be able to find transportation up north. I continued heading east the next morning, intent on reaching Fairfield, only 50 miles away. The going was fairly easy and I was making good time, but about 15 miles from Fairfield, I got my fifth flat. I had just been thinking of how I needed to get a new rear tire when I was in Portland, and so it wasn't too big of a surprise. I was unfortunately out of fresh tubes, so I swapped the old one for one that I had previously patched. Back on the road, I only got about 3 miles before the tube blew another hole. I attempted to patch the first tube, but it kept bleeding air and would go flat before I got anywhere. I briefly thought about walking the 10 or so miles to the nearest bike shop, but it wouldn't have been very practical, especially with all the weight I'd be pushing on a flat. So I walked back a mile to the nearest gas station, where I asked around for a bit before scoring a ride to the shop. The one we stopped at didn't have what I was looking for, so my ride graciously took me to another one, about 10 miles further to Vacaville. I was able to get a couple of tubes in town, and once I had everything swapped out, I set to finding a place for the night. It was a very easy and pleasant ride into Sacramento. With only 40 miles to the city, I took my time and enjoyed the long stretches of straight roads that took me through fields and away from the traffic. There was even a bike path that ran alongside I-80 that kept me off the roads for a little while. I got into Sacramento with the help of the many bike lanes and made my way to the hostel. The next day, I hit the streets to check out the city, first stopping off to purchase my Amtrak ticket to Portland. From there, I checked out the riverfront. It was a fairly lazy day, and I couldn't help but think how quiet it was compared to the bustling streets of San Francisco. Later that night, I walked a block to the park where there was a free concert being held. It wasn't exactly my kind of music, but it was nice to get out and experience a little more of what Sacramento had to offer. My final day in the city was just a day of waiting around for the train to leave. Once it was finally time, I biked to the station and got my gear all packed away. There were no more bike spaces available, so I had to box up my bike, which took a bit of time. The train was running late, so I was all set in that area. Once it finally arrived at 2 in the morning, I learned that they had oversold their tickets and that there were no seats available for myself and half a dozen others. There was, however, space in the lounge area that I could sit in if I wanted. It was an easy decision to make. I got up into the lounge and made myself comfortable, drifting off to sleep sometime after we left the station. I woke up to the sounds of a loud troop of Boy Scouts that had occupied the space. Aside from my noisy fellow travelers, it was nice to just sit back and enjoy the ride. Looking up at the trees through the windows, I was reminded of the glass ball ride in Jurassic Park. It was a long 12 to 13 hour trip, so I stretched out, alternating my time between dozing and watching the landscape pass on by. Once the train arrived in Portland, I quickly repacked my gear and reassembled my bike before setting out to meet up with my friend, a short 6 miles away. It was an easy ride all along the many bike lanes in the city, and in no time I reached my destination. I was super excited to be finishing my 17th week in Portland with my friend, and was looking forward to the next few days ahead.